Hello everyone and welcome to my tier list for patch 14.12. In this video I want to do something a little bit different and focus mainly on walking you guys through the meta and kind of how it works right now. I will say a couple changes I've made is I actually got rid of the C and D tiers, and that's actually because I just think that after some of the changes Riot made recently, such as the first strike changes as well as adding things like Blackfire, I don't actually think there are any champs that deserve to be in C or D tier. I think there are a lot of viable mids, but I also think that the top is pretty top heavy, right? Like the strong mids are very, very strong at the moment. So let me kind of walk you through it. First off, there is a lot of AP junglers, right? AP jungle in general is stronger than AD jungle at the moment, which means that there's going to be a lot of AD mid laners. And the most premier AD mid laner is Tristana. So Tristana is really good as a blind pick because even in Tristana's bad matchup, she still gets priority. She still scales quite well. She's really good at skirmishing. And something that a lot of these AD mid laners do is they use the sustain page super well. So they use Fleet, Absorb, Live. They can use stuff like Second Wind. Sometimes they rush Bork in bad matchups or whatever. Basically, they have a lot of sustain. It's very hard to push out a lane. So Tristana is your premier AD blind. Now, there are champs that are decent into Tristana, and those are, for AD options, you've got Corki and Yone. So both Corki and Yone are actually pretty strong in their own right. They also abuse the sustain really, really well. You have a champ like Yone, which goes, again, Fleet, Absorb Life, Second Wind, D-Shield, and rushes Bork, which is an insane amount of sustain. Corki as well has quite a bit of sustain through his Fleet and Absorb Life. And so both these get picked into Tristana, but they're also quite strong in their own right, which I will come back to. If you want an AP counter pick into Tristana, your premier pick is Hwei. So Hwei is quite good against Tristana because you can just hold the fear. Now, I will say that in this matchup, most of Tristanas do just rush Mercs, and that can make it quite difficult to actually push her out of lane. But I'd see it, I guess, as a neutralizing matchup. Overall, both Trist and Hwei are strong champs, so both sides are still going to be fairly happy with it. But I do think it is slightly favored towards the Hwei. If Hwei is banned and you want an AP option into Trist, you probably want Syndra or maybe Taliyah. Again, I'll come to these champs individually, but both of these are pretty decent into Tristana and can, again, like kind of... It's very hard to push her out of lane, but as Syndra, you can run a first strike page and play to scale. As Taliyah, you normally run phase rush, and again, you're just playing to scale. So your premier AP blind is LeBlanc. Now you're going to see less LeBlanc probably, mainly because of the mid-jungle combinations. Like I said, the AP junglers tend to be better than the AD junglers. And LeBlanc is not ideal with an AP jungler. She much prefers to have gankers around her. So if you use something like Xin Zhao and Pyke, that makes playing against LeBlanc very hard. The reason LeBlanc is so strong, and it's something I talked about in the previous tier list, is that sudden impact is insanely overtuned. So sudden impact has made it so LeBlanc pretty much just wins lane against any range champ now. It used to be that you would lose lane to stuff like Syndra, but now you actually just win the 1v1 as well as having the insane gank setup, just because sudden impact adds so much damage to the early game. If you do end up in one of those matchups where it's too difficult to actually poke them out because they have too much sustain, something like Yone, you can always run a first strike page on LeBlanc, and that's still very good. So she has a lot of options, and I think if LeBlanc is open, honestly, I'd say LeBlanc blind is actually better than Tristana blind if you're disregarding the junglers. Like, just pure matchup, I'd rather have blind LeBlanc. That being said, Tristana is good into LeBlanc, so that is something that you might want to avoid. So talking about the A tiers, I mean, Corki is just quite strong in general. Corki is also good versus both Tristana and LeBlanc. He has mobility, which is good for disengaging from Trist trades. It's good for getting away from LeBlanc ganks. The sustain is really nice. He actually does win trades against both champs if they jump into him, just with E. So normally you start E level 1. Even though you max Q now, you still start E level 1, and that allows you to bully a lot and get a big advantage in these lanes. I will say the runes on this champ do change a little, so most of the time it is Fleet. However, you still sometimes see Hob into Tristana, just because it allows you to win that trade even harder. So that's definitely an option. Now, Yone. I think before I had Yone fairly low, but Yone, I think, is pretty strong at the moment. So with all the sustain buffs, he is virtually unkillable in lane. And he still scales really, really well. And I think particularly he is just good against, like, he's really good against Tristana and Yone. Or sorry, against Tristana and Corki, which makes him very strong in the meta. And after the base armor buff, it was only 3 base armor, but obviously that's quite good against the AD mids. But it's also good against any ranged mid that's going to auto attack you. So I think Yone mid is really, really good right now. And a lot of the time, these champs will get banned. And that will mean that Yone is left over as kind of your premier pick if you want an AD mid laner. So Hwei I already kind of talked about. Hwei is pretty good against Tristana. I think he's not bad against Corki. And I think he's more of a neutralizer against Yone. I think it's now too hard to poke Yone out, but you probably can play a first strike page and just be fine with it. So still very powerful in the meta and a good response to these. Syndra, so Syndra is great into Tristana. She is, yeah, pretty good into Corki, although the movement speed can make it hard. She's also very good against Hui, so there's definitely options here. In the 1v1, you can play Syndra against LeBlanc if you know you're not going to get ganked, but it's pretty rare, right? Like, LeBlanc is always going to be paired with some sort of ganking support or ganking jungler, and you have to be, like, really, really mindful of that, and I do think in the 1v1, it's not as winning as before. That being said, Syndra does outscale LeBlanc pretty hard, so if you do manage to stabilize early game and go even, it can still be decent. But mainly, I use Syndra just as a counter pick into Hui, and into Trist if Hui is banned. Ori is still pretty good as well. So Ori is really good at punishing other mages with Comet. She's also just a pretty strong side laner in general. So against most of these other mids, maybe not, say, Yone, you'll generally win the side lane. So I think Comet or Phase Rush Ori can both be used. Comet Ori, I think, is good against Taliyah, good against Ahri. It's pretty good against Syndra. Not bad versus Hui, good against Corki. It's not so good against the things up here. You could pick it and it would be doable, but I wouldn't go out of my way. Mainly, I would use this again as an anti-mage counter in the similar way to Syndra. She's a bit strong in their 1v1 and a bit strong in the side lane, but she doesn't scale as well as Syndra, and she doesn't have as good gank setup. So that's kind of your trade-off there. Now, Taliyah's still very strong overall. She's a flex pick, which is quite nice. So a lot of the time you'll pick Taliyah and people might think it's in jungle. Just in general, Taliyah is an amazing team fighter and does extremely well if you have any other guaranteed setup on your team. Something like a Rel or a Nautilus can make playing your life a lot easier. I would say she's a little harder to pick in the sense that, like, she is an OP pick, but she is very vulnerable as a blind. Lots of assassins counter her, lots of mages counter her. And also she can be punished by, like, hard engage, especially stuff like Leona that can engage on you, without having to go through your rocks. Like, she can ult you first and then look for the engage, stuff like that. So yeah, I'd say Taliyah is still pretty strong. Now, after that, I would say that's, like, the cutoff point of, like, the super OP, like, often meta pick champs. Other than that, now that we're going to keep going on, these are kind of like champs that have niche situations or just good in solo queue in general. But these, after Taliyah or everything here, is just like very OP, I would say. But after that, it's definitely starting to get a bit more niche. But Ahri is still a very strong solo queue champ. So the reason Ahri is a little harder to pick right now is just because the matchups kind of suck. So like it's very hard to do anything against Yone. I think Corki and Tristana can get free scaling into Ahri. LeBlanc actually now is just a losing matchup for Ahri. So a lot of the meta matchups kind of suck. That being said, if you're playing in a lower elo, or even if you're playing in high elo and a lot of these champs are banned or not picked, Ahri is still very good against basically everything else on the list. And Ahri will always just be a really good solo queue champ. So there's definitely something still worth thinking about. Akshan, I think, is still not bad. They did nerf him a little, but he is just a very chaotic solo queue champ that has the potential to get really fed. Obviously, also can be relatively useless. I think Akshan is not bad into LeBlanc, which is one thing that he's got really good going for him, because a lot of the time, again, these LeBlanc, these main counters such as Tristana and Corki get banned, and then it might be good to have something like this, especially if you aren't picking AP, and you really need an AD mid. Lux, I think, is still pretty underrated. So the thing with Lux is she actually has good matchups into a lot of these things. Used to be good into LeBlanc. I think now probably not as much. But I do think Lux is quite good against Triss, quite good against Corki. Honestly, you can play it versus Hui. You can play it against some of these other things. So it's definitely not like an OP pick. But again, it's just like a very safe, solid solo queue pick. Azir has kind of fallen off a little. He is still really, really good, and a lot of the Azirs actually do run Absorb Life now, so you can get that extra sustain. There are a couple bad matchups, which, again, like LeBlanc is one of the worst ones. Yone is not particularly good, so there are some of these strong champs that are quite good into. I think Azir is not bad into both Tristana and Corki. The thing is, there are going to be better AP picks into that. So you can still look at Azir as kind of like, if you want an AP champ when LeBlanc is banned, and maybe you need like DPS and you need mobility or something, right? Like, it's still a pretty strong pick. It's just kind of held back by some of the meta matchups being a bit too difficult, or just like not really worth playing. Why can I not? There we go. Asol is the next one. So Asol I just have high because he's actually just a really good counter to Azir. In Korea, you mainly see, well, you still see a fair amount of Azir, and you see Asol as the primary counter pick to Azir if, all these like OP champs are banned, which they often are. So for that reason, he's still strong. And honestly, like, Asol is strong in general. He just also is kind of handicapped by the matchups. Like, the matchups are just kind of too hard. And maybe I could see you maybe putting Asol down in the kind of, the very top of B+. I think he kind of still deserves to be here, but like, if you wanted to shift down everything from Ahri onwards into a new tier, I think that would be fine. Now, last one I have here is Naafiri. So I have not seen that much Naafiri, but what little I have seen of it, it looks really strong. So it has a high win rate. And something that was very important with Naafiri before is that she's like one of those champs like Diana that's kind of just like a stat check mid. So she either has the stats to win the trades or she doesn't. And I think now she actually does. And so I think Naafiri could be an underrated AD mid pick and potentially is good into stuff like Corki. I have not played Naafiri on this patch, and I actually haven't played against one, but I have played on a couple of their teams. Like I've played bot lane and I've had Naafiris. And they've looked pretty good. So I think this is a champ that you definitely want to be experimenting with, especially if you're below master. I think chances are this champ is just broken if you're in low elo, because she was already a low elo skewed pick. And the fact that she's probably strong in high elo means she's also probably really, really strong in low elo. So that's basically like how the meta works. That's like the most OP champs at the moment. So the B plus and B tier, you know, these champs are definitely like situationally very strong. A lot of them do have niche picks, so I'll go through some of them. You know, for example, like Renekton is quite good into like Yone, right? And that's like a really good pick. Renekton's also quite good into Yasuo, and I will quickly say that Yasuo also is quite strong. Like Yasuo is really, really good in the 1v1. He's basically impossible to move out of lane now. But the difficulty of Yasuo is that it's still very hard to team fight with him. And I think it's honestly just better to be Yone pretty much any time. But yeah, I think if you get away with a good Yasuo game, it actually is strong. But yeah, I think overall in terms of pickability, it should be pretty low. It should be pretty niche. Other niches on this list, I mean, there's lots of them. Stuff like Ryze is quite good if you see an Akali. You can play something like Jace if all the other AD mids end up getting taken away. There are certain matchups which are kind of good, like Victor is actually a niche counter to Corki. I think Kiana overall is like an underrated AD mid. So there's definitely like lots of things on here that can be used. Other ones I've seen in Korea is like First Strike Vel'Koz or Ziggs or Xerath being picked into Hui. So if you don't play Syndra or Ori or something and you want to play some of those longer range mages, you definitely can. There has been a few things I've seen experimented with. I've seen some people playing Mal's into LeBlanc. Not sold on it personally. There's also Vex into LeBlanc, which again, I'm not too sold, but it's a potential pick. So yeah, I'm pretty much like for the B plus and B, like these champs aren't weak. Like I said, I think there's actually a lot of viability in mid lane right now, and I don't think any champ is just like truly awful. But I do think these champs are overall way more pickable. And the annoying thing about some of these is they crowd out a lot of the other champs, right? Like if people are blinding LeBlanc and Tristana, it's like, well, your champ kind of has to be able to match that level of laning strength. Otherwise, you just can't play. You know what I mean? Because a lot of the time in solo queue, if one of the OP champs is just something that scales really well, then you can actually still play a lot of mids, right? Because even though they will eventually outscale you, you still have that early game period where you can look to snowball. But at the moment, these are two like mega lane bullies. So if you can't like match this bar of laning strength with your champ, or you know have a good matchup into one of the other champs here, you're kind of just left behind. But like I said, I think the B plus and B tiers are certainly viable. That's pretty much it that I have for this one. I'll probably make a longer tier list on the next one. I am actually going to Korea on July the 1st. So I honestly might have my opinions change. Like maybe in Korea I'll decide a champ like Katarina might be broken or something. We'll see how it goes. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this quick little update. And let me know if you kind of liked me walking through the meta. If you have any more questions about champs that are not on this list, or even the placings of someone that's on this list, let me know. I will say I haven't ordered them that well within the tiers, like in my mind, because these champs are more situational and more counter pick oriented. It's kind of like their value will depend on the game itself, right? Like a champ like Xerath has potential to be high B or A, but also has potential to be a low B or a high B or whatever. So worth thinking about that as well. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. Go ahead and like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.